So to output the favorites on the My Favorites page, we can go to this favorites page here in the pages folder and again tap into our context here. Because on this page, we now in the end want to get all the favorites from the context. Now for this, we can of course import use context again from React and also import the favorites context object from the store folder and their favorites context. And then we connect to the context just as we did it before. We create a constant, which then stores this context object, and we call use context and pass this context object we created in that context file to use context. And that gives us the current context snapshot then. Now we got our context here, and that means that now from that favorites context, we can get our favorites array. So in the end here, we can now return, let's say, a section where we say in a h1 tag, my favorites, and below that I want to output a list of meetups, a list of my favorite meetups. For this, we can recycle the meetup list component because this component does not care whether it's all meetups or a subset of the meetups. All it cares about is that we output items that have these properties. So we can import meetup list from the components folder, meetups, meetup list, and then output that below the h1 tag, meetup list, like this. And set the meetups prop here equal to favorites ctx dot favorites, because that is our array of favorites. Now if we do that, on that favorites page, we see all the favorites we have. The problem just is that if I remove a favorite, we don't see anything here, which makes sense because I currently have no favorites. But we might want to render some fallback message for this case. And one way of doing this is that we define a little helper variable here, content, and we then check if favorites context total favorites is equal to 0. Total favorites is another property we're managing in our context. And if that is 0, we know we have no favorites. Then I'll set content equal to, let's say, a paragraph where I simply say you got no favorites yet. Start adding some, question mark. Else, if we do have favorites, I set content equal to my meetup list here. So in the end, to this line of code. And this might look strange, storing HTML elements in variables, but it's actually not stranger than returning HTML elements. You can use JSX code anywhere where a value is needed. We saw it in arrays, in return statements. You can also store JSX in variables. That is totally fine. And now we can simply output the value of that content variable in our returned JSX code to then have different values here, depending on whether we have favorites or not. If we now save this, I got no favorites yet here, but if I add an item as a favorite, I see that instead. And if I remove it, we're back to this other text. So this works. One important note though, if I add an item to my favorites and I then reload the page, it will be lost. The reason for this is that our context is only stored in memory because we're only working with state and with constants here. It's not stored permanently. If you would want to store it permanently, you would need to use some browser storage here in the favorites context provider, like local storage, for example, or store it on a server as well. I'm not doing that here because I want to focus on this core feature of React context, but that is something you could add if you want to enhance this application. For the moment, it's simply some temporary storage which survives as long as we are on this page, but if we ever reload or leave the page, our favorites will be lost. Our meetups won't, because those are stored on a server. It's just something that is worth knowing. And now with that, that's almost it. As a last step, I now just want to make sure that in the main navigation, we also see a badge next to the My Favorites text that indicates how many favorites we currently have. And that simply means that in the main navigation.js file, we also want to connect to context and get values from there. So I'll again import use context here from React and import my context object, the favorites context from going up, store favorites context. And in main navigation, we then get the favorites context by using use context and connecting that to the favorites context. And then here on the favorites link, we can simply add a little extra span next to this My Favorites text, in which we output favorites ctx.total favorites, because that is a number managed in our context with the total number of meetup items in our array. And I'll give this span a class of classes.badge, which is one of the classes prepared in this CSS file I gave to you earlier. And with this, we now have this badge here, and if we add items to the context, that badge does update. And also if we remove items, of course.